Get ready to embark on an eye-opening journey with us as we present to you Perceptions, Knowing Your Heritage. This captivating video is filled with fascinating insights and surprising discoveries that will leave you eager to delve deeper into your own heritage. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of who you are. Remember to hit that like button and share this transformative experience with your friends and family.
Hi, my name is Olori Oleria. This is Perceptions, Knowing Your Heritage. Have you ever wondered about the word racism? Have you ever wondered why the black race seems to be at the bottom of the triangular hierarchy around the world? Have you ever wondered why the black race is considered the bottom feeder, unintelligent, incapable of political or financial structure? Sometimes I even wonder if there's something wrong with us. You see, when you look at the continent as a whole and you look at the political structure, it's as though sub-Saharan Africa is incapable of governing itself. However, this narrative is not complete. It seems like there are missing parts to the puzzle because it has been proven time and time again that you have outliers when they leave the shores of the continent exceed in whatever field they find themselves in, barring the agenda. There is something wrong. There's something wrong about the narratives. And the truth is that we have robbed ourselves and we have been robbed of some historical truths. Truths we have not been taught in school. For instance, in high school, all I was taught was the Mansa Musa, the Yoruba, the Oyo Empire, Benin Empire, Sokoto's Caliphate. Nothing about the slave trade or the intertribal wars was known to me. There's something wrong about these narratives. So in my quest to see the whole picture, I decided to research some great historians like Professor Ali.
In my view, Africa's weakness is mainly due to three things: technological underdevelopment, organizational incompetence, and military impotence.
Professor Ali Mazrui was inspired by Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism into making his documentary, The African, A Triple Heritage, where, in his own view, modern Africa had three influences: the African legacy, the spiritual and cultural influence of Islam from the East and Christianity from the West, and the colonization and imperialist legacy from the West. You see, listening to Professor Ali Mazrui's perception and other historians' perception of the history of Africa and what Africa is today and how it became what it is today, is like referring it to the proverbial blind man and the elephant, where each blind man had their own perception of the elephant based on where they were viewing it from. Historians have given us their own various versions of how Africa has been. But the truth of it is, the continent has encountered a lot of crises and depletions, human and natural resources. Today, I will commence a series where we will put all the pieces of the puzzle together to give a whole picture of where Africa has come from and where it is today during the indigenous slave trade, the export slave trade, colonization, decolonization, and how post-colonization Africa has been affected by all these factors. Before we can understand where Africa is today, we have to start from the very beginning: slavery. Slavery, which is one of the oldest trades known to man, has impacted Africa in a very negative way. Slavery has played an important role in bringing Africa to where it is today. But there is a misconception that slavery is racial in nature. It is not. You see, slavery has occurred around the globe, cross-cultural, religious, social, economic, influences has affected slavery, and the people who, it's been known that people have enslaved themselves and enslaved others, and victims of slavery has also spanned across cross-cultural, cross-racial hierarchies. Okay. So, before we can understand how Africans were exported around the globe, African presence around the world, we must first of all understand that slavery had existed in the world and we need to have an overview of slavery around the world. So let's start with Asia. Here in Asia, religion played an important role. After the Islamic conquest of Persia, the regions around them that had not converted to Islam were enslaved by the Muslims, and as a result, these people who were not converted to Islam were considered legitimate candidates for slavery. In India, after the Muslim invasion of the Hindu kingdoms, other Indians were taken as slaves and were exported to Central Asia and West Asia. Slavery in Central Asia and the Caucasus. The Tang Dynasty in China, for instance, the Koreans, Turks, Persians, Indonesians, and people from Inner Mongolia, Central Asia, and Northern Asia were enslaved by the Chinese, who at that time was a superpower around the Asian region. In one dynasty, many Han Chinese were enslaved in the process of the Mongol invasion. The Qing dynasty, non-Muslims were sold as slaves to other Muslims. Remember, Muslims do not enslave their own, but they enslave other Muslims. In Southeast Asia, during the millennium-long Chinese domination of the Vietnam was a large source of provided a large source of slaves to China. Slavery in Southeast Asia reached its peak in the 18th and early 19th century. Now let us look at Europe, and we're going to break this into two. What was slavery like pre the 1500s and post 1500s? Okay, European slavery, which is also known as white slavery by the Barbary, refers to slavery of Europeans, whether by non-Europeans or by the Europeans themselves. And slaves of European origin were present in ancient Rome and the Ottoman Empire. Let's look at Spain in 1492. Spain consisted of different nations, different categories of people were enslaved in each, and slavery was conducted under different regulations. Slavery was cross-cultural and multi-ethnic, and slavery played an important role in the development of the economy of Spain. The Al-Andalus, which is also called Islamic Iberia. During this era, the Moors, that is the Moors controlled much of that peninsula, and they imported white Christian slaves between the 18th century up until the Reconquista in the late 15th century. That is a long period. The slaves were exported from the Christian section of Spain into other Muslim regions in northern Africa. The circular slavery during the Caliphate of Cordoba is perhaps the well-known in Al-Andalus, which is also known as Muslim Iberia in Spain. Here, European slaves were trafficked from northern or eastern Europe to northern Africa. Then let's come back to Christian Iberia. Here, the Christian kingdoms in northern Iberia existed originally as a continuation of the Visigoths' practices. Now, the Visigoths initially enslaved the Christians before they converted to Christianity. And then they enslaved the Moors from the north to their own region. And this period was over the 8th to the 11th centuries in the Christian kingdoms. So with the phasing of the Christian slavery, the Christian kingdoms passed through a period where most slaves would come from the Muslim south. Under the Roman laws, the idea that slavery was based on race was one of the greatest misconceptions about slavery in Spain. Okay, so now let's look at slavery in Europe after the 1500s. In 1442, the Pope Eugene IV gave the Portuguese the right to explore Africa. At that time, Spain was occupied by a Muslim power, and the Catholic Church felt threatened. Protecting the church, Pope Nicholas V in 1452 gave the right to enslave anyone who was not practicing the Christian religion. The Spanish government created the Hacienda system, which functioned between the years of 1543 and 1834. The Hacienda allowed other countries to sell people into slavery to the Spanish, but not the Spanish people. And then we look at the Americans, the enslavement of the indigenous America. In February 1495, Christopher Columbus took the captive of over 1,500 Arawaks, and about half of that population died when they were shipped to Spain. So, now let's look at slavery in Africa. Africa has been blooded and torn at its ethnic seams. African slavery can be categorized into indigenous slavery and export slavery. Indigenous slavery means slavery within the African ethnic societies, pre-export slavery. Now, slavery at this time was basically born out of warfares as an expansion of kingdoms, or as a result of debt payment, or as a result of a particular ethnic group which was weaker than the other, who was kind of seeking protection from other stronger forces, would succumb to slavery or servitude to the stronger force, or as a result of expansion of military, the military of certain kingdoms. Now, oftentimes these slaves became part of the household of the slave owners. There are certain cases of chattel slavery where the slaves became the property of the slave owners, but oftentimes they were treated as part of the household pre-export slavery. Farming also was one of the factors where people were easily enslaved. Human bondage and sacrifice was another reason for or cause for slavery in Africa, pre-export slavery. In pre-colonial Africa, indigenous war was profoundly important in shaping Africa's past. It has been both the outcome of and driver of broader political, social, and economic change in Africa. Now let's look at export slavery and the effect, and compare and contrast how these two factors, or how similar or different they were. Now, in export slavery, it was shaped by the Roman institution of slavery, and later the Christian views of slavery, the Islamic institutions of slavery via the Muslim slave trade, and the Atlantic slave trade, which was the most devastating of it all. The export slavery fostered severe ethnic fractionalization and undermined extra social and political structures in territories in Africa. Export slavery literally destroyed the political structure of the African nation. Between 1400s to 1900s, the African continent experienced 4 different types of slave trade. The largest is the transatlantic slave trade. In the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were shipped from West Africa, West Central Africa, and Eastern Africa to the European colonies in the New World. The other 3 slave trades are the Trans-Saharan. The Trans-Saharan is probably one of the oldest forms of slave trade. During the Trans-Saharan slave trade, slaves were taken from the South Saharan desert and shipped to Northern Africa. The Red Sea slave trade slaves were taken from the inner land of the Red Sea and shipped to the Middle East and India. During the Indian Ocean slave trade, slaves were taken from Eastern Africa and shipped either to the Middle East, India, or to plantation islands in the Indian Oceans. When the Trans-Saharan slave trade, Indian Ocean slave trade, and the Atlantic slave trade began, many of the pre-existing colonial African slave systems began supplying captives for slave markets outside Africa. At this point, let me reiterate that only Africa exported its own kind to the world. The rest of the world, yes, practiced slavery, but none exported its own kind en masse to the rest of the world. Africa literally distributed its own around the world, and hence the derogatory terms ascribed to Africans. Let me just give an analogy here. Go figure. If you're a person not of color, living in the, let's say, 15th century, never seen a black person before, and your only encounter of a black person is when you see them off the slave ships, and they are not treated with any form of dignity. You see grown men and women, children, stripped naked, beaten, battered, hungry, famished, dirty, looking any little less, or looking any not better than an animal. I read an article, an Indian article concerning race, where of course the black race was at the bottom of the triangle. And it was said that in the Indian society, they had class in the society. And the black race, they called them, I've forgotten the name they called them, but they were such that some had political power, some had financial power, some had social relevance, some could earn or own slaves or earn some form of financial. But the black person, I've forgotten the name they call them, are such that they are no better than dogs. So much so that when they eat from a plate, no other human, which means an Indian, should eat from that plate. It's the way you would treat a rabid animal that you don't want to come in contact with. And you wonder why. It's not born out of meanness. It's what was the first encounter. And I'm sure most of our leaders that did this did not envisage this coming, and in fact. Slave trade impeded the formation of a broader ethnic group, leading to, like I said, fractionalization, and it resulted in the weakening and underdevelopment of political structures. I would like to call the first scavenge for Africa started with the Trans-Saharan slave trade. And this can be dated to as far back as the Roman Empire around the 5th century, which established a slave market to buy and sell slaves from the African interior in Egypt. Black slaves were highly valued in the Mediterranean. Also, the Muslim participation in the slave trade started between the 8th and the 9th century, beginning with small-scale movement of people, largely from the Eastern Great Lakes region and the Sahel. Islamic laws allowed slavery but prohibited the slavery involving pre-existing Muslims. As a result, the main target for slavery were people who lived in the frontier areas of Islam in Africa. The Indian Ocean slave trade occurred about the same time, and also has a long history, beginning with the control of the sea routes by the Afro-Arab traders in the 9th century. The enslavement of Africans for Eastern markets started about the 7th century. After the involvement of the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire, slave trading became a major enterprise. After the 1st century, the export of black Africans became a constant factor. Under the Sasanian Under the Sasanians, Indian Ocean trade was used to transport slaves from Africa. They were sold throughout the Middle East. Eventually, tens of thousands per year were taken. On the Swahili coast, the Afro-Arab slavers captured Bantu people from the interior and brought them to the Lipuro. Now let's look at the Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the first Europeans to arrive in Africa were the Portuguese, and they arrived at the coast of Guinea. Their initial plan was to trade in ivory, gold, and spices. But they set up colonies around that area. But around the 16th century, some Portuguese settlers found that the volcanic islands were very ideal for growing sugar. Sugar growing is very labor intensive, and they could not do it themselves. So they engaged the labor of the pre-existing slaves from the indigenous slave trade to help them cultivate the volcanic islands to produce sugar. That's about when all this started, because they now took some of these slaves back to their own land so they could use their skill to cultivate sugar on their own land. And that is how slaves, the transatlantic slave trade originally began. This trade left Africa underdeveloped, demographically unbalanced, and vulnerable to future European colonization. The transatlantic slave trade peaked around the 18th century when the largest number of Africans were bought or captured from West Africa and taken to the Americas. The increase in the demand for slaves due to the expansion of European colonial powers in the New World was much more lucrative to the West African powers, leading to the establishment of a number of actual West African empires thriving in slave trade. These kingdoms relied on constant warfare to generate the great numbers of human captives required for trade with the Europeans. Slave trade was transformed from a marginal aspect of economics to the largest sector in a relatively short time. Economic urban centers that served as the route of many trade routes shifted towards the west coast. At that time, many African communities relocated far away from the slave routes, often protecting themselves from Atlantic slave trade, but hindering economic and technological development at the same time. This resulted in a general decrease in the quality of life, working conditions, and the status due to slavery in West African societies. Now let's look at the statistics of how Africans were spread around the globe. Between 1500 and 1900, it is estimated that about 17 million African slaves were transported by the Muslim traders to the coast of the Indian Ocean and the Middle East and North Africa. Zanzibar was one of East Africa's main slave trading ports, and under the Omani Arabs, as many as 50,000 slaves were passing through the city each year up until the 19th century. The establishment of the Dutch Indian Ocean Company in the early 17th century led to a quick increase in the volume of slave trade in that region. There were perhaps up to 500,000 slaves in various Dutch colonies during the 17th and 18th century in the Indian Ocean. The Indian and Chinese slave traders supplied Dutch Indonesia with perhaps 250,000 slaves during the 17th and the 18th century. The East India Company EIC was established for this purpose, and it carried slaves to Dutch East Indies. The EIC mostly traded in African slaves, but also in Asian slaves purchased from the Indian, Indonesian, and Chinese slave traders. Now, let us look at the effect of slavery on the economy of Africa. Have you ever considered what the effect of slavery has done to the economy of Africa? I know we all have an idea of what it is, but do we know the facts? So let us take it in bits and pieces. So slave trade, we all know, undermined the local economic and political stability of the African community. Okay? As slave trades and civil wars became commonplace, the villages' vital labor forces were shipped abroad, were exported. With the rise of a large commercial slave trade, driven by European needs, enslaving your enemy became less a consequence of war, but rather more a reason to go to war. The slave trade impeded the formation of larger ethnic groups that could have made a stronger communities around Africa. It caused ethnic factionalization, and it weakened the formation for stable political structure in many places. It also reduced the mental health and the social development of the African people. At the peak of the slave trade, hundreds of thousands of muskets, vast quantities of cloth, gunpowder, and metal were being shipped to Guinea and across Africa. Most of this money was spent on European-made firearms of poor quality, should I mention, and industrial-grade alcohol. African trade with Europe was at its peak of the Atlantic slave trade, and it included significant exports of gold and ivory, plus the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade devastated the African economy. In the 19th century, across Africa, economic activity was described to be at its lowest ever, while life and property were being taken daily, and normal living was in jeopardy because of the fear of being kidnapped. What was the effect of slavery on the European economy? And I'm going to leave you with this quote from Karl Marx. He said, in his Economic History of Capitalism, he argued that the slave trade was part of what he termed the primitive accumulation of European capital, the non-capitalist accumulation of wealth that preceded the creation of financial conditions for Western Europe's industrialization and the advent of the capitalist mode of production. I will leave you to ponder on these points and facts. And I would like to end this episode on this for you to think about what slavery had done, on the effect of slavery on the African continent. And in our next episode, we'll continue on this to look at how export slavery led to industrialization, colonization, and much more.
We would like to extend our gratitude to you for taking the time to watch Perceptions, a show that delves into the exploration of one's roots and heritage. I am looking forward to the chance to see you again in the future. If you find this post valuable, we kindly request that you like and share it with your friends and family.